Canadians who believed immigration levels were high had always been around 30% during the past decades. But in 2023, this happened. And in 2024, this. More than double in just 2 years. The housing crisis, the rising cost of living, and the arrival of more than 3 million immigrants in the last 3 years caused anti-immigration sentiment to skyrocket.
It's gone too far. You know, we need to start taking a look at what's happening in Europe, in the Western world, in Australia, in the UK, in London. Take it as a stark warning, guys. Because you see the mass invasion of their country over there, it's happening here already.
In this video, we will explain why public opinion about immigration changed so quickly in Canada, and what this means for the country's future.
Long live Canada! Long live Canada!
When Canada was born as a nation in 1867, it emerged as the union of two peoples, the British and the French. The Confederation was a pragmatic political pact between historical enemies who had to learn to govern their differences to avoid breaking apart. The country's stability depended on managing this diversity, which at first was limited to a narrow strip of settlements in the eastern part of the territory. The rest of the country was almost empty, and to consolidate it, it needed to be populated. So at the end of the 19th century, Canada launched one of the most ambitious immigration campaigns in the world. Under the slogan, "The Last Best West," it offered free land to anyone willing to farm it in the western prairies. Between 1896 and 1914, almost 2 million immigrants crossed the Atlantic, attracted by that promise. Hundreds of towns and cities were founded along the border with the United States, and the country stopped being just an eastern strip of settlements to become a continental nation. By 1930, the country had reached 10 million people, tripling its population in just 60 years and building the foundations of what today is its modern identity. With the Great Depression, immigration stopped, but after the Second World War, the country's openness accelerated once again. The horror of racism and decolonization of the world transformed the mindset of Western democracies, and Canada began to build its modern immigration system, one that was much more open to everyone. In 1962, it eliminated race and nationality as immigration criteria. But the big change came in 1967 when it introduced the points system. It was the first of its kind in the world, by which those who could contribute the most to the country would have the best chances of being accepted. Variables like education, age, profession, language proficiency, and adaptability were measured. During those years, Canada was living through a deep identity conflict. The rise of Quebec nationalism, the arrival of non-European immigrants, and the decline of the British Empire pushed the country to distance itself from the old Anglo-Saxon ideal and start seeking a new identity. The government understood that it can no longer define itself by blood or origin, but by coexistence among differences. So in 1971, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau formalized that answer by declaring multiculturalism as official state policy. Instead of forcing immigrants to assimilate, each community can maintain its identity as long as they shared a common national project. That vision was legally anchored in 1982 with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when cultural and linguistic diversity was recognized as part of the fundamental rights of citizenship. Being different stopped being an exception and became a right protected by the state. In 1988, that principle was solidified with the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, the first law in the world to declare diversity as an essential part of national identity. Canada went from managing difference to turning it into a virtue. It seems like the perfect formula: an immigration system based on merit, an institutional balance between languages and cultures, and a welfare state that guaranteed equal opportunities for everyone. In the following decades, the newly arrived immigrants became the driving force behind the country's economic growth. Universities attracted international talent, tech companies expanded, and major cities turned into centers of innovation and commerce. Every year, tens of thousands of new professionals arrived, fueling key sectors like healthcare, engineering, finance, and education. The Canadian model wasn't just successful, it was exportable. Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom partially copied its point system, convinced that the combination of meritocracy and multiculturalism was the path to the future. By the mid-2010s, 70% of Canadians believed immigration made the country stronger, and immigration was no longer a topic of political debate, but a source of national pride. Being Canadian meant being tolerant and embracing immigration, and no government dared to question it. In 2015, Justin Trudeau came into office with the idea that Canada can not only maintain its immigration pace, but should increase it. The country needed more workers, more students, and more young families, because demographic aging was a problem, and immigration was the only lever capable of sustaining the labor market and financing the welfare system. So between 2016 and 2019, the country received on average more than 300,000 new permanent residents per year, an unprecedented figure at that time. And the targets for the following years were set at more than 400,000 annually. Universities competed to attract international students. The technology and healthcare sectors depended more and more on immigrant labor, and the main cities were growing at a pace that inspired pride. But in 2020, the entire planet came to a halt. The pandemic closed borders, overwhelmed hospitals, and paralyzed the sectors most dependent on immigration. For the first time in decades, Canada experienced what it was like to live without new immigrants. And when the world reopened, the dominant narrative was that there was a labor shortage crisis. Everyone believed there weren't enough workers in major sectors like construction, manufacturing, or healthcare, and that it wasn't possible to have too many immigrants. On the contrary, immigration was seen as the solution to every problem. So in 2022, the government set new immigration targets, reaching nearly 500,000 permanent immigrants per year. But the forecasts were quickly surpassed by reality, and the country added roughly 1 million people a year for the next 3 years in a row. It was the largest population increase in Canada's history. The growth wasn't driven only by permanent immigrants. Universities, which were increasingly dependent on international tuition fees, multiplied the number of foreign students, and the country issued hundreds of thousands of temporary work permits as provinces competed to attract labor and human capital. Temporary residents, students, and workers rose from 1.4 million in 2022 to 2.8 million in 2024. For a while, everything seemed to be working. The country was growing, consumption was increasing, and the labor market remained strong. But that growth had a problem. What had been for decades a gradual, planned, and predictable process turned into an expansion that exceeded the country's ability to absorb it. And nowhere was that pressure more visible than in the housing market.
One of the challenges we're facing in Canada is our population with immigration and other things has been growing over the past years, and housing construction hasn't kept up, which is a real problem.
The record demographic growth of the last decade wasn't distributed evenly. Almost 60% of new immigrants settled in just 3 metropolitan areas: Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, which didn't have the physical or administrative capacity to absorb such a massive influx. But in addition, Canada builds very little and very slowly. The urban zoning system continues to favor single-family housing, even in areas where land has become scarce and expensive. Permits for new projects can take years, and regulatory costs add between 15% and 20% to the final price of every home. And with the restrictions during the pandemic, this rigidity only got worse. In a country that grew much faster than it could build, the gap between supply and demand made prices skyrocket. In February 2019, the average price of a home in Canada was 470,000 Canadian dollars. By February 2022, it had reached 816,000, a more than 70% increase in just 3 years. And rents followed the same trend. Although the rise wasn't as dramatic as home prices, the pace was still very high by historical standards, more than 10% per year during those years. Meanwhile, the vacancy rate fell to 1.5% in 2023, the lowest level since records exist. It wasn't just a shortage, it was a functional collapse of the market. People had to fight just to find a place to live. In university towns, international students began to run out of housing, and some ended up living in motels, in cars, or in illegally subdivided rooms. In suburban areas of Toronto, municipal authorities found cases of more than 20 people living in a single basement. As prices rose, thousands of Canadians started moving to smaller cities, looking for alternatives. But that internal exodus only transferred the pressure. The prices went up there too, and the imbalance spread nationwide. The lack of coordination between levels of government was at the heart of the problem. While the federal government was pushing ambitious immigration targets, municipalities, The ones directly responsible for granting permits, planning services, and building infrastructure weren't given realistic timelines or resources. No one was controlling the entire process, and the housing crisis became the clearest expression of a system that had lost synchronization between ambition and capacity. But housing was only the first visible symptom of a much broader phenomenon. Because when the population grows faster than the system can absorb, the imbalance spreads to every area. In 2019, about 4.5 million Canadians didn't have a family doctor. By 2023, that number had surpassed 6.5 million. With fewer family doctors, the number of emergency room visits rose by 1 million in a single year, and the average waiting time in hospitals increased by more than 40%. This pressure was made worse by the loss of specialized personnel, as many doctors and nurses moved to the United States, attracted by better working conditions. Hospitals, already overloaded, had to rely on temporary or foreign staff, creating a cycle of dependence that was difficult to reverse. Education faced a similar dynamic. The number of international students, rising from 350,000 in 2015 to more than 900,000 in 2024, brought significant revenue to universities, but also overwhelmed campuses and housing systems. In public schools, the strain was also evident. The increase in the child population in urban areas caused overcrowded classrooms and infrastructure shortages. Provincial governments demanded help from the federal government, arguing that immigration planning hadn't considered the real capacity of public services. Hospitals were asking for more funding, universities were requesting temporary admission limits, and municipalities were calling for urgent investments in transportation and sanitation. Water and energy services faced the same pressures, as they weren't prepared to expand at the same pace as the population. For the first time, the very system that made the Canadian promise possible began to crack from within. And to all of this, we must add the imported tensions. Religious conflicts, political disputes, or ethnic rivalries that were born far from Canada but were now finding echoes on its own streets. Protests over foreign wars, boycotts between communities, and increasingly deep ideological divisions. The country that once took pride in welcoming everyone was now discovering that diversity could also reproduce the world's fractures. All of this created a new kind of unease, one that was no longer directed only at the government in power, but at the model that had defined the nation for the past half-century. And the data proves it. In 2022, 27% of Canadians said there was too much immigration in the country. By 2023, that number had risen to 44%, and by 2024, it reached 58%, more than double in just 2 years. For the first time in decades, the promise that immigration would strengthen the economy began to sound distant compared to a reality where most people saw their quality of life stagnate or decline. Movements and campaigns appeared with slogans like "Take Back Canada," led by groups denouncing the loss of control over immigration. Anti-immigration sentiment stopped being marginal and became part of the public debate, and multiculturalism began to be questioned as a potential source of imbalance. But the most significant change was that disappointment also spread among immigrants themselves. Many newcomers discovered that the Canadian dream that had attracted them no longer existed. Promises of jobs, stability, and access to basic services clashed with a reality of unaffordable prices, skyrocketing rents, and overloaded public systems. Some began leaving the country, convinced that the opportunity they were seeking wasn't in Canada, but somewhere else. The general discontent was so great that in October 2024, the federal government of Justin Trudeau had to admit they had made mistakes.
Because in the tumultuous times as we emerged from the pandemic, between addressing labor needs and maintaining population growth, we didn't get the balance quite right.
And it announced the largest immigration cut in its recent history.
Today, we're announcing that we will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years, which will result in a pause in the population growth over the next 2 years.
The same state that had promoted demographic expansion explicitly decided to slow down the very growth it once considered its greatest strength. The reasons were economic, but also political. By the end of 2024, the government was nearing elections, but it was weakened, with polls showing that less than 20% of Canadians wanted Trudeau to stay on as Prime Minister. A few months later, in early 2025, Justin Trudeau left power after nearly a decade in office, worn down by a crisis he had helped accelerate. His successor, Mark Carney, from the same political party, took office with a promise to restore balance between growth and sustainability. The model of unlimited openness was no longer sustainable. Canada is now trapped in a paradox. It needs more immigrants to keep growing, but the pace of openness in recent years has overwhelmed its ability to absorb them. The problem isn't immigration itself, but the speed and lack of planning with which it has happened. Immigration policies accelerated, but infrastructure did not. The federal government kept increasing quotas, while provinces and municipalities, the ones responsible for providing housing, transportation, and public services, were left behind. At the same time, the type of immigration has also changed. It was no longer just permanent residents planning to settle, but millions of temporary students and workers concentrated in the same 3 cities. That distorted the labor market, drove rents higher, and created a growing sense of disorder. The challenge, then, isn't just how many people arrive, but who arrives, where they go, and under what conditions. Canada needs a more balanced policy, one that links the number of new immigrants to the real housing and service capacity of each region. One that encourages settlement in less populated provinces and speeds up the recognition of immigrants' degrees and professions, so the country can use the talent already within its borders. At its core, the big question isn't whether Canada should open or close its doors. It's whether the country can manage its growth without losing stability, fairness, and the promise of a better life for everyone. That's all for today's video. If you liked it, don't miss the next one.